easier for him.
All right, so as we begin, I'd like you to turn to Matthew chapter 28. And we'll start in verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went up to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, to the very end of the age. So, that Great Commission there is one of the foundational things for all of sacramental Christianity. And again, as a reminder, as we wrap up our ground level work on the basics of Catholic theology, in a sense, the central sacraments, remember there are 7 of them in Roman Catholicism, the central ones are these sacraments of initiation. So baptism is the first one. It's basically, how are you brought into this life of faith? And for both Catholics and for Lutherans, we're brought in via holy baptism. And then as we continue on, we're going to take the rest of the time today to talk about the Eucharist. So just as a reminder, we have 3 different things that are foundational in the understanding of the Catholic confession of the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper. The first one is the sacrifice of the Mass, and we're going to talk about that in more depth and detail. And the other is transubstantiation. Again, something we're going to talk in depth and detail today. And then the last thing is closed communion. They practice that, although I include the question mark because there are certain circumstances and situations where communion would be open to non-Catholics. Usually that involves grave injury, risk of death. There are also occasions where those coming from the Eastern Orthodox Church would be able to receive closed communion because the relationship between Rome and the Eastern Church is not a two-way street, not all the way. Rome looks a lot more favorably upon the Eastern Orthodox Church than the Eastern Orthodox Church looks upon Rome. And so there are certain circumstances that are granted from all the way up top that help us indicate that people in the Eastern Orthodox Church would be in good standing to receive communion at a Catholic service without having to go confirmation and all of everything else with that. That being said, let us talk about the sacrifice of the Mass. But to get going with this, let's turn to the book of Hebrews. Turn to the book of Hebrews. So let's turn to chapter 9, starting at verse 11. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent not made with hands, that is, not of his creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer, sanctified for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who makes it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not a force, even as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." And in the same way he sprinkled with blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus it was necessary for the copies of heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but these heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own. For then he would have to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of ages, to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly awaiting him. So we will pause there for a moment. One of the things that we have to remember when it comes to sacraments, and that which makes a sacrament is what? What are the two things, scripturally speaking, that establish a sacrament? You have the Word of God and the physical element. And this is both Old and New Testament. Hebrews 9 here reminds us that the Old Covenant is sealed with very physical and real blood. The promises of God in the Old Covenant are sealed with the blood of the unblemished lamb, with all of the different sacrifices. And that is necessary for the people to show that what is happening as a result of sin is not just some exercise of the mind. It's not just something in our spirit which is out there in the ether, but rather sin has very physical effects in the world. If you want to put it into the language of science and physics, sin is the reason why the second law of thermodynamics exists, everything moving from order to disorder. And so for us, the way in which that disorder is overcome is through the right reordering of creation by the work of God. And it begins with, in a sense, the human heart, physically and spiritually, in these covenants that God establishes in both the Old Testament as well as the New Covenant that God gives us in the Lord's Supper. And so for us, we're in a lot of lockstep in many ways with the Roman Catholic Church with regard to the importance of receiving the Lord's Supper, of being baptized. But then, as we'll see, some of the ways in which we get to the end point become pretty different. They start at the same place, but then they branch off pretty decisively. But that's not to say that there still is this incredibly important physical element that is there for both the writers of the Old Testament as well as the writers of the New Testament, which makes sense because the Holy Spirit is the same Spirit of the Lord that overshadows the prophets to give them utterances, and it's the same Spirit of the Lord that overshadows his Christ and his disciples to allow the gospel to be proclaimed forth and come to us as we receive it today. Any questions or comments on that? That's an important thing to note and to remember for not just Roman Catholic theology, but for our own theology as well. And it's passages like Hebrews 9 that also give us a sense of why it's not just a memorial meal, a matter of remembrance in our minds, and sort of a way to just verbalize our confession of faith. It reminds us of the very physical nature by which God has worked and is continuing to work in this life of faith. Yes?
I was watching a podcast the other day. It was between a Reformed person and a Roman Catholic, and they were talking about the Eucharist. So I was wondering what percent, and she didn't even mention that Protestants believe in the true presence. The Protestant person did. And so I was wondering, what do you think the percentage of churches that actually are Protestant that receive the true presence?
Well, I mean, it's basically just Lutherans and some Anglicans, essentially. There are some Reformed who would argue they believe in the real presence. It's just that the real presence is only in heaven and not on earth, which is not really the real presence that we're referring to, but from their understanding, that's what the real presence would be. So I would say it's, of the whole scope of Protestantism, including things like Baptist, non-denominational, Pentecostal theology, then we're looking at a smaller percentage, less than 50%, if not less than like 35 or 25%. And even then, you see surveys from time to time of even places like the LCMS by national organizations. And it's not as if there's 100% of people in the LCMS who believe the real presence either, for one reason or another. Sometimes it's just maybe not as well catechized, sometimes it's just a difference of faith, and so they attend an LCMS church, but they don't necessarily receive communion because they just can't take that step of Christ being truly present physically in the Lord's Supper. In fact, I have a person in my own congregation who did exactly that, very faithful attending, never came up for communion because he just couldn't get past the idea of the real presence. And so he was aware enough of both our theology and his stance to not come forward, or if he did, just to receive the blessing. So I'd say less than 50% of Protestants. It's more probably like less than 35%, especially if you give the rise of things like Pentecostalism in places like the Global South, where in like Brazil, for example, you have huge charismatic churches that have otherwise taken people who were nominally Catholic and would have confessed something, at least according to the dogmatic understanding of the real presence, and are now fully involved in the life of these charismatic Pentecostal churches. So I would say that percentage is decreasing even more.
I think these churches get hung up on, do this in remembrance of me. They get hung up on that word, remembrance of it, so it's a memorial.
Yeah, and I think part of that gets to a westernized understanding of what remembrance is as merely an intellectual act. We have a lot of language of remember in the Old Testament. In the Hebrew, that is directly connected also to physical action as well. I'll use a negative example. I'm not saying this is exactly what it is, but you can think of it in this fashion. It's like soldiers who remember. It's not just in their mind. They remember because like they smell gasoline. They can feel the heat of bullets grazing by them, even if they're years and years and years removed from their experiences at war. So that's the negative example, but that's sort of what's meant by remembrance even in the Old Testament. It's not just kind of take a note in the back of your head, remember, like, oh, I gotta remember to pick up eggs, but more it's a holistic body, mind, soul reliving, if you will. Close to re-sacrifice, but not quite. Any other questions? So getting to the sacrifice of the Mass then. According to a Roman Catholic understanding, the sacrifice of the Mass is a real sacrifice. It's not a reenactment. So they would not be like, to use a frivolous example, like the Civil War reenactors that are redoing the Battle of Gettysburg from time to time. They would say that there's something very real and physical happening. Again, Catholics are very sacramental in the physical sense as well as in the spiritual sense. So it is a very real sacrifice that is happening. And as we see in the Catholic Catechism, it states that it makes present one sacrifice of Christ. So they would say, on one hand, yes, Christ's sacrifice was once for all. But on the other hand, if you want a way to maybe think through it or see what this means, it's as if they wouldn't maybe exactly describe it like this, but for our purposes, like we're almost time traveling, if you will, like we're at the foot of the cross once again when celebrating the Lord's Supper in a Roman Catholic church. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but that's a way to think about it. It's not just a reenactment. It's you're physically present in there, or it's as if the actual Good Friday is transferred in somehow into where we are at on Sunday morning for a Roman Catholic. But the other thing that is a part of this understanding of the sacrifice of the Mass is that it's not just Christ's sacrifice, but it is also the sacrifice of the faithful. And so you'll hear times of this language of surrender at times from Roman Catholic theologians. You're surrendering your heart, soul, mind, and will to Christ and His work. It's language that for us we would avoid maybe, but I think we could understand as Lutherans where they're coming from. It's similar in a way to this idea of deny yourself, take up your cross and follow Jesus that we hear very clearly stated in the Gospels. But there is a sense of two-way streetness, if you will, with regard to this understanding of the sacrifice in this language of surrender. Whereas we would say it's wholly and inevitably only one way, God coming down to humanity. And it's in the renewal of our heart, mind, and spirit that, yes, we can deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Jesus. But the actual act of receiving communion, there is nothing that is sort of burst out, if you will. It's not a sacrifice on ours. It's completely and only the sacrifice of Christ. So I would not classify it completely as works righteousness in terms of their understanding of the sacrifice of the Mass. But you can understand and see how that step is more easily taken. There is a bigger sense of the two-way street rather than the one-way street. Yes?
Yeah, don't they see it as some sort of merit, that they're performing a merit, it's a works righteousness in a sense?
Not necessarily receiving the sacrament, or at least they would say that, no, that's not what we mean. Now, there are other things that you can do, like the giving of alms, or the sacrifice of penance, that would, in a sense, be earning merit, if you will, making forgiveness apply to you by virtue of doing those acts. But they would say that that the Lord's Supper is still Christ's gift for us. But like I said, there is this sense, and we see it when you expand out the larger parts of theology and the other sacraments, in a sense, and how they flow out of, penance flows out of something like the Eucharist and its understanding that if it's what you said is not present, maybe the sacrifice of the Mass, but certainly that which flows out of that understanding then has the next conclusion that follows after there with something like the sacrament of penance, if that makes any sense at all. I will say, just as a bit of a brief aside, historically speaking, that it has been utilized illegitimately, and I think even Catholics today, and I think even maybe after like Vatican II, would look back and say that some of the uses of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, to get people out of purgatory, doing a sacrifice of the Mass for the dead, was an abuse of theology. I do believe there's been some repudiation of that by Catholic theologians coming out of the Middle Ages and coming out in response to some of the Reformation criticisms. So in those senses, that has happened as you described it, but I think most Catholics today and most Catholic theologians will say, well, that was actually not true Catholic theology, but an example of an abuse of that theology. That doesn't mean they agree with the Reformers and are becoming Lutheran, but what it does say is that they have an awareness to recognize that things were wrong in the past, especially when it comes to stuff like that. So we do want to be pretty fair to our Catholic brothers and sisters now, that it's not just they're doing the same exact thing that's happening with the Reformation. In some ways, there are some things that still look and feel and sound the same, but then there are a lot of things that have been radically transformed and changed. Yeah.
Well, the Spanish settlements that came into North America, very Catholic, obviously, they emphasized about Christ's body, blood, because that's what they named places, like the Sangre Cristo Mountains, the blood of Christ. Corpus Christi is the body of Christ. So it was an important part of their theology that they even put a label on the geography of where they existed. But when we get into Paul's letters, there's lots of talk about us sacrificing ourselves to Christ. Romans, I present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship or reasonable service. And in Galatians, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. So it's talking about now that we have been redeemed, our response is to sacrifice.
Yeah. It comes out of the deny yourself rather than reliving. And you get to a point that we actually see here, but before we get to this figure that is on our screen, was there a hand up over on this side? I'm not sure if I saw one out of the corner of my eye or not. So, does anybody know who this person is?
Aquinas?
Yes. St. Thomas Aquinas. And so when it comes to especially transubstantiation for the purposes of our discussion, but for a lot of things in Catholic theology, to be a little overly simplistic, Aquinas is responsible for much of what Roman Catholic theology is today. And one of the significant things that comes out of Thomas Aquinas and his work as a theologian is his devotion to the philosophy of Aristotle. And the word that describes Aquinas and some of the other colleagues of his day in terms of how they approached theology and life, they were known as scholastics. I think I spelled that right. I never got close to winning the geography being in school, grade school in case it wasn't clear through my adventures in spelling before. Let me turn that so everybody can see that. So these are two terms that are incredibly important to help know and understand Thomas Aquinas in terms of the formulation of his theology and the larger environment that he's working in his life. Aristotelian philosophy begins to make a significant comeback in the West, coming out of about the 9th or 10th century. And you really start to see a development of ancient Greek philosophy being harmonized and sanctified, if you will, by the Western Church. Some of this is due to things like the Islamic expansion. And ironically enough, the West had kind of lost the Greek philosophers, but in a lot of ways, some of the Islamic thinkers coming out of these caliphates rediscovered them. And so, if you remember, algebra really develops out of Islamic conquest, but part of that is driven by the discovery and the reading of some of these ancient Greek texts, people like Pythagoras and his Pythagorean theorem when it comes to geometry, Euclid, Aristotle, Plato. They're rediscovered in the Western Church through the exposure happening in all of this geopolitical upheaval, and as such, people like Thomas Aquinas then utilize this to try to resolve some tension that is there with regard to things like the Eucharist. How can it be truly Christ's body and blood, and how can it also be bread and wine? So Aquinas, in his work, especially coming from an Aristotelian philosophical background, approached things not just with the biblical text in mind, but in a sense was trying to fit it perfectly, if you will, with Aristotelian philosophy. So a lot of, again, the understanding of something like transubstantiation is as much to do with philosophy as it does with theology. those two things are not necessarily the same thing. They don't have complete overlap. Any questions or comments
Yeah.
or clarification? Yes.
I do. At the painting, at the bottom, I can't see all of them, there are objects. And is there a purpose?
Oh, it's just so this iconography usually gives us, and a lot of iconography tells us a bit about the person. So Aquinas and his heart for Christ, you have the scriptures here, you have the church, and yeah. So it's just basically showing the foundational things that were a part of Aquinas' life and understanding.
So it's come on.
Yes. A lot of the theologians, people like Thomas Aquinas and others, are monks or have specific orders that they're a part of. So Luther, for example, does anybody remember what order he belonged to?
Augustinian.
Yes, he was an Augustinian monk, an Augustinian friar. Then you have a lot of thinkers who come out of the Jesuit camp, the Dominican camp, etc. But Aquinas, just some things that, again, are important for him. The explanation of how the bread and wine, through the consecration work, becomes the body and blood of Christ, the affirmation of the real presence, and then this is something that Steve brought up, it is important to note, and we'll talk about a little bit later, but there is a special place in Thomas Aquinas' theology for the Lord's Supper. He holds that in higher regard than any other sacrament, if you will. And generally speaking, a lot of Catholic theologians would say that in many ways baptism and Lord's Supper is, in a sense, the primary life of the church, and then the other 5 sacraments are working in support of that, secondary to that. And as we talked a little bit about in our history of the Nicene Creed, the 2 sacraments that have always been recognized by the church and across all the ages has been baptism and the Lord's Supper. You had probably right around the 6th or 7th century, some theologians were saying there are like hundreds of sacraments, there are thousands of sacraments, everything becomes sacramental in some ways. But whether there are hundreds of sacraments or 2 sacraments, it's always baptism and the Lord's Supper that are present across Eastern theologians in the early church, Western theologians, and then even as they develop and grow from there. Any other questions or comments on some of this? Again, Aquinas is really responsible for the codification of something like the real presence, that he is truly present in the Eucharist and it's not symbolic. And again, transubstantiation is probably his biggest contribution to specific Eucharistic theology. With that being said, there are 2 words that come up quite a bit that are really important to note and understand with regard to this understanding of transubstantiation. Both of these words are taken straight out of Aristotelian philosophy: accidents and substance. So we have several views that pop up through the ages in terms of what the real presence is. You have things like consubstantiation. So con means with. So there's this concurrent sense that bread and wine and body and blood happen. And so there are times where people would say that Lutherans practice consubstantiation. That's not true. We don't put a definition on it. Because consubstantiation would, if you want to think about it, sort of in what is it, Venn diagrams, the overlapping circles. Consubstantiation kind of looks like this, where there's a lot of overlap, but there's still sort of this separation. In reality, the Lutheran understanding of the Lord's Supper is like, you know, it is body and blood, it is bread and wine. They're not concurrent with one another, it just is what it is. We can't explain it through human reason, we just receive it on faith as Christ instructed us and as given by the apostles. So it's not necessarily sort of overlapping, it is just the same thing in, with, and under, if you will. But for Aquinas, and there's also this understanding of annihilation as well. So when Christ's body and blood appear, as soon as they are consumed, they are annihilated. The bread and wine are annihilated. It's like they no longer exist at all. And instead, it's only Christ's body and blood. But for Aquinas, as he's thinking through things from an Aristotelian philosophical perspective, there is some uncertainty in his mind. It runs into a problem. How does this happen? How does this happen when the body and blood destroy the substance of the bread and wine? And so, usually for those who would say this annihilation idea, it's when the Eucharistic prayer, that is the words of institution, the ritual is performed, the sacrifice is offered, if you will, talking about the sacrifice of the Mass. And then at the moment of that in consumption, that's when the bread and wine cease to exist and the body and blood are all that remains. They are converted. So Aquinas distinguishes the substance and the accidents. So the changing of bread and wine into body and blood is the accident. For transubstantiation, the bread and wine stay the same. The accidents, that's the word in Aristotelian philosophy, but their substance, their being, is wholly changed to body and blood. And also he would say that Christ isn't stuck in the elements, he is still present all around. And this idea of Christ not being stuck in the elements is one of the significant differences between Catholics and Calvinists. Calvin's problem is, well, how could Christ both be in heaven as well as everywhere on earth when it comes to receiving the Lord's Supper? So his solution was, Christ is physically present in the Lord's Supper, but he is only present in heaven. And it's only bread and wine. Because, Christ can't be everywhere at once, which is a bit of a denial of his omnipotence, which is why we're not Calvinists. And why Calvin starts to break quite a bit with Luther and the other Lutheran reformers and theologians who still confess the real presence of Christ every time the Lord's Supper is there. Like, the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, if you will. But we don't quite have the accidents in the substance. We don't have this philosophical sleight of hand in a lot of ways to try to explain it. We just let it be. But just, again, to review these terms, just so that everybody's clear, accidents refers to the actual